I know you've had a chance to read about the Roman government, do some highlighting. Let's help you make sense of everything that you've read. From 753 BCE to 509 BCE, Rome was ruled as a monarchy. So they had a series of kings, and as the story goes, in 509 BCE, the king's son, the future king, committed a crime. And when the people came to the king demanding punishment of his son, the king did not. At that point, the people rose up in rebellion and overthrew the king, and stated that Rome should never have a king again. So then the question began, what should they do? And while, as we saw previously, the Greeks had a number of different types of governments that they used amongst their polis, the Romans settled on something new. They established a republic. A republic is a government that's kind of like a democracy, but a little bit different. In fact, if you think about the United States, what exactly really are we? Oftentimes in class, students will say, well, we're a democracy. But if you think about the Pledge of Allegiance, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic. That's really what we are. You see, in a true democracy, the people who represents you is you. But that becomes a bit impractical when you start talking about thousands, or in the case of the United States, millions of people. So that's where republics come in, and this is what Rome established. It's nothing more than a government where people get to choose their leaders to be their representatives. And that's in essence what we do. Another big part of what's going to influence Roman government are the two social classes that make up Rome. There are patricians and plebeians. So ask yourself, which one do you want to be? Well, that all depends on what you want to do. You could be the patricians. These were really the early advisors to the monarch. They tended to be wealthy, landowners, and had political power and influence. Versus the plebeians, which are the common people, everybody else. Their sheer numbers, though, make them powerful. So they may not have great wealth, or they may not have great political power, but they do have numbers power. And we'll see how that plays out. Okay. Here's the graphic organizer that we're going to use to help you understand the components that make up Roman Republic. I put my information in the circles, but in no particular order. You don't have to do that. You can use whatever circle that you want. The first part of Roman Republic, you see here at the top, is known as the Roman Senate. The 300 in parentheses is because there's 300 senators. All right, these are people from the patrician class. I refer to them as the Pats, so if you want to abbreviate and call them the Pats, as long as you remember that they're the patricians, that's fine. So these are the wealthy people that often help support the early kings who have built up enormous wealth and political power. They serve really for their entire lifetime, and that position typically is passed on to their sons. The power of Senate is great, and that is they control money. The same thing is similar today. If the president decides he wants to fund some new program, he can say that publicly, but he ultimately has to go, of course, to the Senate and the rest of Congress to get the okay for the funding. So the power of the Senate is they control how taxes are going to be spent. Now the problem with the Senate is there's 300 of them. So there's 300 individuals with 300 different opinions, perhaps, who may not always agree. And that's why we see here on the left the beginnings of what's known as the consuls. Again, 2 is in parentheses because there are 2 of them. Think of these almost like presidents. So while we have 1, they had 2. And consuls are elected by the Senate. Well, not surprising, who do you think they're going to elect? Patricians or plebeians? It tended to be patricians, so they elect amongst themselves. And these consuls, unlike our presidents who often try to work for their next re-election, these consuls only serve 1 year. So they're not in office for very long. So they have to really focus on getting things done during their year. And likewise, they don't have to really worry about re-election because they're not allowed to serve again for another 10 years before they get elected consul. Now, the one problem with consuls is there are two of them, so they may not always agree. And so there could be some infighting between the two consuls, which could slow down the process. Well, as you see so far, you see the patricians control the Senate, and patricians really control the consuls. What does the common person really get to do? And the truth is not a whole lot at this point. And that's why eventually the plebeians demand what's known as the assembly. The assembly is where the plebeians get to gather together and to discuss the issues, but again, they don't control money, and they don't really control the overall government. That's the consuls. But they did begin to use strikes to their advantage. All right, so the question is, who cares? They're nothing more than a bunch of plebeians, common people. Why are they, if they're striking, what's the big deal? Well, hopefully you've figured out the big deal is they are the people who do all the work, grow the crops, often serve in the military. So it is a big deal. And eventually the plebeians were able to gain what's known as the famous 12 Tables. This was a set of written laws which guaranteed the rights of plebeians. This was a big step because the laws were written down. And by having them written down, literally written in stone, if you will, that means they couldn't be changed or interpreted by the patricians. Now, this didn't give them much say still in the government, but at least they had guaranteed rights. Eventually, the plebeians, using more strikes, were able to gain the position of tribunes. Again, 10 is in parentheses because there are 10 tribunes. These individuals are plebeians or plebes, and they were allowed to sit in the Roman Senate. They could overhear the conversations that the patricians were going through, talking about how taxes were going to be spent. And they had one very important power, and that is the tribunes had what's known as veto power, or I forbid. So with this power, they could forbid certain actions that the Senate was trying to take that they saw as unjust. In essence, this is the cycle of the Republic, and it's very similar to today. We have a Senate. Our consuls is known as a president. Our tribunes are greater in number, but this is the House of Representatives. And of course, the assembly is still the American people who get to vote. So what you're seeing here on the screen in the video is nothing more than really something that we kind of copy and adapted for ourselves. Now, how well does this system really work? The truth is, it works, but it doesn't. It's cumbersome. There's a lot of discussing, arguing, sending things back and forth. That's really what we see even today. And it doesn't work well, especially in times of crisis. So when you're facing some natural crisis, or you're facing some potential enemy, republics are not great because they're slow to respond. And that's why in time of crisis, the Romans did away with the republic. They needed action now. And the republic really wasn't designed for action right now. And that's why they eventually turned to dictatorship. Dictators have complete power for a limited period of time. So the Republic did realize that we don't want dictators in there too long. So the limit was up to 6 months. If the crisis only takes 2 months, then the dictator is expected to be done in 2 months. This is the story that was in the reading about Cincinnatus. Here's the statue of Cincinnatus, working the fields, farming the fields. They come to him about a crisis. Cincinnatus lays down the plow. He picks up the sword, in this case the bundle of rods and the axe, which is a symbol of power, and goes deal with the crisis. And when the crisis is over, he lays down the bundle of rods and sword, and goes back to the plow. That's how it's supposed to work. That's not always how it always worked. So my question for you is, what happens if a dictator who has all power suddenly decides the crisis isn't over in 6 months? Well, the Senate can, of course, vote him into power to continue, or can vote somebody else in to continue. But since the dictator has all power, what if he happens to change the law prior to 6 months, reaching that 6-month limit? What happens if his name happens to be Julius Caesar, and he sees himself in his power of dictator, and looks to extend that to perhaps a year, or perhaps 2 years, or maybe even a lifetime. If he's able to change the law because he has all power, what can be done about it? And that's why eventually Julius Caesar gets what I call stab, stab, poke, poke. Because the only way to stop him, since he had all power, is the senators realized perhaps the best way was to get rid of Caesar himself, that he was extending his power, that he was talking about becoming dictator for life. And again, they don't want kings, and they saw this as nothing more than kingship. Overall, the Republic works, at least it did for 500 years, but there were issues along the way. Hopefully this clarifies some of the things that you read and highlighted.